Welcome, everybody. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma for our monthly webinar series. I am Dr. Jane Irongo. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Center and Director of ENCO, and I'm very delighted to be your host today. For those of you joining us for the first time, ENCO offers 2 webinars per month on the first and last Wednesday. Our next webinar will be presented on February the 24th, and the title will be The Miss Education of Black Male Athlete, Student Athlete, How Socio-Demographic Self-Identifiers Influence Their Identity, Development, and their involvement in college. Please visit our website at www.enco.ou.edu for the full list of webinars on demand and upcoming webinars for this season. I welcome you to use the chat box right now to tell us where you're joining us from. You're also welcome to tweet, to Instagram, and to share using the hashtag ENCO webinars, hashtag start the conversation online. It is incredibly important for us to stay connected, especially during these uncertain times. Our panelists today are Kat Stevens, a third-year PhD student in higher education administration, Taylor Lewis, a third-year master's student pursuing a dual master's degree in higher education administration and public policy and public administration. We also have Patricia Tita, currently a full-time higher education doctoral candidate and staff member with residence education. Last but not least, we have Kelechi Ohiri, a community organizer, entrepreneur, and scholar activist pursuing a master's in higher education. Our panelists are all from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Their topic today is ADOS, blank countries and which Black Lives Matter, engaging contemporary intra-racial and transnational dynamics surrounding Black college students. The center is very, very grateful for their expertise. Please post questions in the Q&A box, and our panelists will address them at the end of the presentation. And just a reminder that closed captioning and ASL are available for this broadcast. Welcome, team. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Black History Month. My name is Kelechi Ohiri, and I speak on behalf of my entire research team in saying that we are so pleased that you have joined us here today for our presentation, ADOS, S-Whole Countries, and Which Black Lives Matter. Of all the places and virtual spaces you could be occupying today, you chose to join us here, and for that, we are super grateful. We also want to express our gratitude to NCORE for hosting the space for today's important conversation. As we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our title may be jarring for some and uncomfortable for others. We also want to acknowledge that the title and the emotions it may evoke for each of us based on our own unique experiences influence the way in which we enter this space and subsequently engage. We were very intentional with choosing this title. We had the option to omit the cursing slur allegedly used by someone in a very powerful position in our country while discussing certain foreign countries with largely Black populations. However, we realized that the sentiments shared by that person, the words they used, and their viewpoints, which speak to a larger national viewpoint, all relate to the context of our presentation. Racism, white supremacy, and nativism are uncomfortable phenomenons to experience and witness. We understand that, and we hope to use this presentation to engage that thoughtfully but boldly. We also want to state that erasure is harmful and damaging. Erasure is what happens when that word was used to describe Black nations, and it's also what happens when we, out of our own discomfort, try to act like it didn't happen. With 2 members of our presenting group being from the countries mentioned, myself being one of them, we're standing against the erasure today and positioning ourselves in this uncomfortable space with you all to have this very necessary conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the other members of my team and let's get this thing started.
Thank you, Kelechi. Thank you so much. I apologize in advance for the mispronunciation, and I want to show my utmost respect to the indigenous people. This stolen land on which we inhabit is physically situated in the original ancestral homeland of the Nipmuc and Nonotuck for Massachusetts, Nisenan, Miwok, Madu, and Miwok for California, and the Tuxanets and the Noccotanks for Virginia. We pay respect to the indigenous people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout their historical diaspora. We honor the stolen people forced to work on this stolen land, now known more broadly as the United States. Names we often do not know. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, in particular, the erasure of both indigenous and African identities, not under only slavery, but via racist laws that segregated all people into an existential binary classification of white and Black. So my name is Tita Feraud-King. I am a PhD candidate in the higher education program at UMass Amherst. I also completed my social justice education certificate at UMass. Before we begin, I must acknowledge our positionality. We are a team of Black identifying grads with foreign-born identities. Some of us are immigrants, international students, and children of immigrants with mixed African diaspora background from different Caribbean and African countries. We are today missing 2 other team members who will not be presenting with us, but should be acknowledged. And we are also working under 2 Black identifying women faculty members, named Dr. Ashley Comforter from Appalachian State University and Dr. Crystal George Mwangi from UMass Amherst. Being a Black immigrant, children of immigrant impact the way we view the world and our work today. Feel free to tweet us during this presentation. And throughout this presentation, we will have audience interaction questions throughout. And we encourage you to engage with us in the dialogue throughout in the chat box. I'm going to provide a brief overview of our presentation. First, we're going to go over the scope of our work and the lens that we are using. And then we will grapple with the question, which Black lives matter? Afterwards, we will provide you some demographics of Black transnational students and talk about the conflict within that demographic. And then we will explore the practical implications in relationship to Black Lives Matter, ADOS movement, the Trump era and policies, the COVID-19, and how it looks on college campuses. And then we'll move towards talking about recommendations and research moving forward. And then we'll have a great conversation with y'all, answering questions. So the scope of our work. So from where we were then to where we are now. This project is part of a larger years-long research on Black transnational collegiate population. We were originally focusing on their contemporary issues, experiences in and outside of higher ed. We noticed that there was an emerging conversation about African descendants of slaves movement, known as ADOS, and the call for reparation for only those with American slave ancestry. We were also exploring the impacts of Trump's comments and the xenophobic perspectives that was spewed across the United States. And there was also the continuing conversation about Black Lives Matter. And then, as everyone is aware of, COVID hit, which changed the course of our research, including our timeline and the scope of our work. During that period, there was more awareness of racial and ethnic disparity within and outside of the US. more discussion about anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Our current research is still ongoing, and we're still exploring our data. So this leads to our presentation today, where we'll be exploring the ways in which white supremacy is pervasive and harmful to all Black collegians through contemporary issues, because it creates a singular, monolithic story of Black lives that excludes foreign-born Black students and Black children of immigrant collegians. We'll be presenting findings from our previous qualitative studies and preliminary data from our ongoing study. This session will focus on how the current US social political climate related explicitly to anti-Black racism and nativism is impacting Black students of diverse ethnicities and nativities, as well as Black interracial dynamics on campus. We are looking through a critical lens using the learning race in the US context framework. So this framework that's on the screen before you, I will admit, is very complex, and I will try to briefly explain this framework. Learning race in the US context, also known as LRUSC, emerged in 2014 by Freeze Britt, George Mwangi, and Prata to understand foreign-born collegians of color complex identities. This theory considered experiences that impact identity, including original home countries, perspectives, dominant narratives, and campus climate. LRUSC is a three-part model that shows the ebbs and flows of identity development for foreign-born students of color. The three parts are, there's an unexamined US racial ethnic identity. This position is not critical, focused more on their ethnic identity. And then students tend to move towards identity examination in US context because of racial ethnic counters like racism, microaggression, and other racialized events, which forces them to explore their racial identity. From there, hopefully, they begin to move towards an integrative awareness in the US context, where foreign-born students of color move from a strong ethnic identity towards a more critical, complicated, racialized ethnic identity. We are using this framework as a lens to examine our data and the topics of this presentation. In addition, we are also using this framework to grapple with this question and we're also asking you this question: which Black lives matter? Considering that there is a growing movement focused on Black victims at the hands of police brutality and systematic racism, and this movement was started in the US by 3 Black women, we're thinking about, are Black immigrant and Black international students' needs and experiences being ignored? How are they being excluded from the dominant narrative of Black lives mattering? In the chat, we encourage you to write down your thoughts. When you hear the question, when you hear Blackness in the US, who do you think of? And we'll give you a minute to write down your answers in the chat. And we definitely encourage you, as you're writing your answers, which we really appreciate, feel free to use descriptions. So how would you define Blackness in the United States? When you hear the word Blackness in the United States.
Thank you all so much for participating in answering that question. I see that we still have some answers coming in, so feel free to continue. I'm back, so let's go ahead and start talking demographics. The answer of who considers themselves a Black student is very dependent on who you ask. Those who consider themselves Black students may be very different than those who various universities consider a Black student to be. Who gets to define themselves as a Black student? Are you Black if you self-identify as such? Are you Black if society identifies you as such? All questions we're asking. Blackness is vast and incredibly nuanced. It's important for us to talk about the words used and attempt to capture its nuanced dimensions as we move through this presentation. So, for the sake of clarity, we will offer a few working definitions of how we will be using various terms, as well as troubling others. Terms we're going to be using in this presentation include Black, which is a term we use when referring to members of the African diaspora living in the United States. We will also refer to people by their nativity, country of origin, or in the case where we are sharing anecdotes from our study, we will describe students as they describe themselves. Foreign born is a term we will use to refer to Black people who were born outside of the United States. Immigrant, we use to refer to a person who relocated from their country of origin to the United States. African diaspora is characterized by the movement of Africans and peoples of African descent. Terms used more generally include African American, which is also used to describe Black people. It's a term currently being troubled in society. Troubling language is important because we do have some lapses in our language as we describe Black folk. Societally, we're still negotiating a word that specifically refers to Black people whose lineage in this country traces back to enslaved folks. Groups like ADOS, who we will discuss a little later, are attempting to address that lapse. There are questions of whether a word creating distinction between folks with lineage of African ancestors who were enslaved in the Caribbean or South America as opposed to the United States should exist. There are also questions of what words second-generation Americans who have parents from another country should use to identify. As we move more into demographic data and statistics, it's really important to state that some of the data may appear a bit dated. Most certainly, there's space for more to be done in the realm of data collection, so we can continue to get more updated numbers and statistics. There isn't a uniform collection method for data in these populations yet, and we realize it's really important to name that. We can, however, speculate that updated numbers would show even more expansion in these communities. While still comprising a small population of the overall Black community and a smaller still portion of the overall US immigrant population, sub-Saharan African immigrants are a demographic growing rapidly as this chart demonstrates. This demographic is actually one of the fastest growing immigrant populations in the United States, increasing by almost 100% into the 21st century. According to a report by the Migration Policy Institute, if the trends of the past decade continue, by 2020, Africa will likely replace the Caribbean as the major source region of the US Black immigrant population. Of course, COVID has created some challenges in data collection as well, so we look forward to research emerging soon to confirm if that was indeed the case. More on demographics of Black immigrants in the United States. There are 5.6 million Black immigrants in the US. The top African countries these immigrants are coming from are Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Ghana. The top 3 Caribbean countries are Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Jamaica. The top 5 states where Black immigrants reside are California, Florida, New Jersey, New York, and Texas. Now, let's zoom in a little bit in our data and talk more about Black immigrant and international collegians. Immigrant student, also referred to as foreign student in this presentation, refers to non-citizens who are currently enrolled in higher educational degree courses in the United States. This definition does not distinguish between students holding non-residential visas and those with permanent residential status. The former usually arrive and stay independently, while the latter usually migrate because their parents moved, making them 1.5 generation immigrants. Speaking of this population, 4% of international students originated from Africa. The top African countries that the international students originated from are Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa. The open door aggregate of all Latin American and Caribbean international students is 9%. Most of the Black immigrants are enrolled in undergraduate level courses or undergraduate level study. In 2014, roughly 29% of Black immigrants obtain a bachelor's degree or higher. Now I'll turn it over to Kat to speak more about the impact of this expanding demographic of collegians.
Thank you so much, Kelechi. My name is Kat J. Stevens, and I'm a third-year PhD student in higher education, and I'm an immigrant to the US from Guyana. The existing conflict is intra-racial, intra-communal, and intra-ethnic amongst African diaspora students. This conflict continues, narrowing to the academic environment, both in and out of the classroom. It starts as early as in one's post-secondary education at the admissions and recruitment stage, then matriculation and the awarding of scholarships and funding. This conflict continues socio-emotionally through the development of peer and friend circles. It continues in campus-wide supports, student and academic affairs, and the campus affinity spaces earmarked for these diverse Black students, even the naming of these spaces. The conflict is visible as students navigate friend circles within the crucial first 6 weeks of college or graduate school. Students make their connections, learn more about themselves, those around them, sometimes with a shift in perspective and growing racial identity formation. Upon closer examination, this conflict is continually, though not only, created and upheld by institutions via enrollment management and admissions, communications and marketing. There's also a lack of transparent, accurate, disaggregated data on admissions, yield, matriculation, financial awards, student demographics. While it starts there, it can continue to seep into the classroom via faculty, their syllabi, residence halls, and cultural affinity spaces. There are many things that can be done to support these brewing conflicts, and we will continue this presentation with these conflicts in mind, considering solutions and best practices. The conflicts that arise leave diverse Black students disconnected from each other, without room to introduce their heritage and lineage to community members outside of their shared lineage. This can be short-sighted, with impact on creating truly inclusive, dynamic learning spaces in and out of the classroom. Many of the immigrant and international students research participants spoke to their social and academic isolation. Additionally, many student green card holders are not in receipt of the same level of intentional support as their international student peers are. We need accurate data collection that informs institutional decision-making, programming, transitional support for all foreign students, not just those who are coded as international students. This absence of nuance, understanding, blatant erasure leaves many feeling invisible as disruptors as if they cleave to their own ethnic and nativist identity. The conflation of naming and identifying African diaspora students alongside flattening of African diaspora students' experiences, this does a disservice to us all. So considering these conflicts, we have a PhD student here named Simone. This is taken from my study on Afro-Caribbean Collegians and their ethnic and racialized identity while they're in attendance at predominantly white institutions. She shares, because I live here in America, I'm fully versed in going in and out of, Black American language and experiences, ways of being. It's not always expected for people to understand us in my career, but we have to understand everybody else. I have to jump in and out of different cultures at the same time, finding Caribbean aware scholars. It's hard for me, like a foreign Black person tax. I hop from white culture to Black American culture to academic culture, maintaining my own culture, and it's isolating. Simone speaks to the challenges and extra work of culture and code switching, being misunderstood, hoping to be understood, and academic challenges. Simone often feels invisible and yet visible. So in the chat, I would love for you to answer this question. How would you support this graduate student from these points of entries, whether you're in academic affairs, student affairs, faculty, staff, classmate, or institutional leadership? Please put your responses in the chat.
Okay, as we're thinking and starting to answer, I want to thank Kat for discussing the conflict, and thank you to everyone who participated in our participation question yet again, or who is still forming an answer. Let's begin to talk about the practical implications of this. Black Lives Matter is an international social movement founded in 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murder. The simple hashtag Black Lives Matter blossomed from a viral internet phenomenon to a full-blown organization dedicated to fighting racism and anti-Black violence, especially in the form of police brutality. The quote displayed on your screen is taken directly from the organization's website. In the years following its founding, Black Lives Matter has transitioned from a single organization to an international movement for social justice in defense of Black lives around the world. The declaration, Black Lives Matter, signals condemnation of state-sanctioned violence targeting Black people, more specifically, the unjust killing of Black people by the police, where in the United States, they are far more likely to die than any other racial group. BLM is the demand that society value the life and humanity of Black people as much as it values the lives and humanity of white people, or anyone else in this country for that matter. Structurally, Black Lives Matter operates via individual city chapters, which set local agendas based on the needs in the city. Notable chapters are often associated with cities where police brutality is rampant or where very large national cases of police brutality have occurred, such as Ferguson, Missouri. This movement has been met with a response by the law enforcement community, where supporters have started using the hashtag Blue Lives Matter. It's important to note that Black Lives Matter is distinctive in placing value on Black life, the act of which doesn't call for the devaluing of any other life or uniform color. As Black Lives Matter has progressed over the near decade since its inception, it's transitioned from a social media hashtag to a marching order, a song and step, for people across the world addressing state-sanctioned violence targeting Black people. Black Lives Matter could be heard chanted by Parisians in front of the Eiffel Tower, showing support for American protesters calling for justice after the murder of George Floyd last summer. It could also be heard in the streets of Lagos, Nigeria, my home country, as youth took to the streets in the EndSARS movement as they protested police brutality. ADOS, which stands for American Descendants of Slavery, is not only a burgeoning political movement, but also an introduction of new language seeking to, quote, reclaim, restore the critical national character of the African-American identity and experience, one grounded in our group's unique lineage and which is central to our continuing struggle for social and economic justice in the United States. It was founded by Howard grad and host of the Breaking Brown political show, Yvette Carnell, and UCLA alumnus and attorney, Anthony Moore, who also hosts a weekly talk show named Tone Talks. ADOS as a lineage of people, a quickly emerging political organization and political movement focuses specifically on the, quote, brutal economic system of the United States, with the central goal of this movement being addressing economic inequality in the form of reparations. This focus is based on the belief that the reality of ADOS life is seen no more clearly than in the racialized wealth gap existing in the United States. American descendants of slavery served as the financial engine upon which capital in this nation was built. ADOS is quite clear in being a political movement first and foremost, based in policy that addresses economic inequality and demands a payment of debt owed to an entire lineage of people. White supremacy is such that Black folks as a whole are seeking justice in the United States based on a shared experience of anti-Blackness. However, Blackness is such that the specific experiences of various folk under this very nuanced umbrella impact the specific needs that must be addressed and the various tactics that may be employed to do so. ADOS is one of the first mainstream movements of this era to address this head-on by seeking a specific type of justice for a specific subset of the African diaspora. There is a very valid and important logic for being mindful of various Black experiences in our movement building. Our needs as Black folk are deeply impacted by our various experiences and relationship to this nation and white supremacy. Implementation and actualizing this need in various forms of justice seem to be where many members of the Black community differ on tactics. So let's look at a student quote. I'd like to share this brief quote from a participant of our study, a student who self-identifies as African-American, Black, and the descendant of slaves said the following when asked about who counts as Black. People who came from slavery should count as Black. People who are Caribbean and African, even if second generation, are more immigrants. There's a big difference in experiences. Though the student didn't reference any specific movement or an ideology surrounding it, we could see that students are beginning to think about the dynamics and challenging questions playing out in larger societal contexts. Let's talk more about how our students are negotiating these challenges on campuses. I wanted to start with an incident that happened in 2017, which really speaks to the way the tactics we use when seeking justice impact intra-racial dynamics in the Black community. Some of you may recall this example. In October of 2017, the Black Student United organization at Cornell University presented a letter to the university president demanding a campus environment that is safe and supportive for Black students. One of the demands to this effect was, quote, a plan to actively increase the number of underrepresented Black students on campus, defining underrepresented Black students as, quote, Black Americans who have several generations, specifically more than 2 in the United States. Although there were multiple demands made in the letter, the media and broader community really picked up on this one. So you'll see that in the next slide, immense pressure from the media and other Black students in the campus community led the group to release the following statement. The purpose of the demand was specifically to address the need for an increased presence of underrepresented Black American students at Cornell. Our mission aims to support all students of the African diaspora, both nationally and internationally, as we're a board comprised of Africans, Caribbeans, and Black Americans. We have and continue to reach out to African and Caribbean groups on campus in the spirit of dialogue and discussion surrounding this topic. Finally, we hope to rebuild any trust we may have lost from our community members, and we will continue to fight for the expansion of opportunities for all of our community. Responses to the incident continued as showed by this opinion piece, published on Sunspots entitled The Elephant in the Room, Combating White Supremacy Should Not Entail Throwing Other Black Students Under the Bus. This discourse is continuing on. In 2019, Simmons College hosted the first national conference for American descendants of slavery. ADOS is now a movement being discussed in widespread Black movement spaces and gaining traction through discourse on social media applications like Twitter and Clubhouse, where the founders often engage in spirited discussions that mirror the challenges expressed through these examples. As we contemplate all of this, I want to remind us that both our historical Black liberation movements and our contemporary Black Lives Matter movement have transnational Black ties, with Black immigrants long being leaders in the struggle. So who are the folks on our screen right now? Marcus Garvey, born in Jamaica in 1887, lived for some time in New York. He's the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. He was a proponent of the Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism movements, inspiring the Nation of Islam and the Rastafarian movement. Audre Lorde, also known as Gamba Adisa, was born in New York in 1934 to Caribbean immigrants. She was an activist and writer who positioned herself as a Black feminist lesbian mother poet. Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, was born in Trinidad in 1941 and moved to US as a child and was naturalized at the age of 13. He was a leader with the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, and later in life tagged the term Black Power and joined the Black Panther Party, ultimately becoming an advocate for Pan-Africanism. Finally, Opal Tometi, born in the United States to Nigerian parents, is the founder, or one of the founders, of the Black Lives Matter movement and the executive director for the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, a national organization that educates and advocates to further immigrant rights and racial justice together with African American, Afro-Latino, African, and Caribbean immigrant communities. So all of this being said, I pose the following question to you. What examples have you seen of the intra-communal negotiations around movement building? What about language surrounding Black identity? Feel free to answer in the chat.
All right, thank you for your participation in the chat. Feel free to continue sharing your thoughts in the chat. My name is Taylor, and I am a master's student at UMass Amherst. I'm going to continue practical implications by discussing US foreign and immigration policies' impact on Black international and immigrant students, highlighting policies under the Trump administration, as well as COVID-19. First, I'll start with former President Trump's alleged comments regarding Caribbean and African nations. A legislative aide reported that on January 11th, 2018, in an Oval Office talk with several US senators about protecting immigrants from Haiti, El Salvador, and African countries in a new immigration package, former President Trump allegedly said, "Why do we want all these people from asshole countries here? We should bring in more people from places like Norway." In these alleged statements, former President Trump continued to complain that Nigerian immigrants would never, quote, go back to their huts, and Haitians, quote, all have AIDS. And asked, quote, why do we need more Haitians? Take them out. This is an example of how Black international students experience complicated intersections of race with other dimensions of other social identities, such as nativity and ethnicity. In this case, specifically, racist nativism. Former President Trump might have denied these statements, but these alleged statements are a reflection of 21st century immigration, a system that spans multiple administrations and is rooted in neoliberalism. 21st century immigration serves to maximize value in an economic and financial sense, as well as moral and emotional terms for global power and a positive representation to the world. Immigrants' human capital are rising sharply. 48% of recently arrived immigrants were college graduates, compared to just 27% of arrivals a quarter century earlier. Underlining former President Trump's alleged comments is racist ideology and anti-Blackness. According to former President Trump, these people living in quote huts and quote living with AIDS will only stay in America. I don't want to equate people's humanity or migration to their economic productivity, but want to make note that scholars and professionals not only come from African and Caribbean nations like Nigeria and Haiti, but are also contributing significantly to their own countries for generations. However, the global dynamics of anti-Blackness and white supremacy seek to diminish and erase that. Former President Trump may have called out Pacific ethnicities and nations, but his last comments represent the West view of Blackness. For maybe the first time, Black immigrants and national students are being subject to anti-Blackness and seeing their country, nationality, and identity via US racial political lens. Next, I'll transition to talk about the travel ban or the student ban. In 2017, the Trump administration issued 3 travel bans. The countries included in some or all of the bans are Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Chad, and Venezuela. To note the effect on international students, travel bans became known as the student ban. This sudden political and policy decision caused confusion among international students, universities, Customs and Borders Protection, and US Citizenship and Immigration Services. In the media, we saw students stranded at airports or in fear of traveling. In addition to these travel and academic concerns, international students became the targets of racism and Islamophobia. The implication of this policy needs to be broken down further, because students with various immigration statuses are not one-faced. There are 4 African nations with predominantly Black populations included in this travel ban, but the hashtag No Muslim ban and student ban are focused on people from the Middle East. This brings up the question of which Black lives matter, asking this question specifically to the field of higher education. There is not much discourse on how this impacted Black international students who were or are still navigating race and nativism, as well as the intersection of anti-Blackness and Islamophobia. As far as practice, it was not framed as a Black college student issue, an issue that needed programming, support, and institutional resources. When using a homogeneous lens, only recognizing Black students as African-American, Black American, or generally a monolith, the first group of Black students' issues and concerns are not fully addressed. And now I'll talk about COVID-19. When discussing COVID-19, everything is new and preliminary because we're still in the middle of a historic event that has altered our daily lives and systems that we're still unraveling effects and will be for years to come. COVID is political and connected to a myriad of social political issues. Our early data from the DBS study reflects that. Our participants in the DBS study have discussed the intersections of racial unrest, COVID, and economic crisis. Sabrina, a participant in the DBS study, painted a powerful image, saying COVID-19, you can think of it as a storm. We're all in the storm and we're on different boats. Some people literally just have like a floaty and are just trying to hold on. Some people are in a boat that is full of water and all you can do is pour water out every single day. And some people are on a yacht just waiting out the storm. We cannot fully talk about COVID without mentioning this summer's social justice movements and even our social political systems. Black people face a disproportionate risk of both contracting COVID and dying from it. Octavia, another participant in the DBS study, shared that we are hit the hardest, from losing jobs, losing homes, to losing life. We've been struck the hardest. The gap between whites and non-whites is just the American way. COVID's impact on Black people is connected to a history of racism and racial trauma, which have led to a lack of access to quality healthcare and medical racism. Racism and racial stressors are causes of many underlying pre-existing conditions that make Black people a vulnerable population. Black students are experiencing negative psychological effects and are feeling unseen and unsupported by the institutions. In the midst of an already stressful event, institutions must recognize that COVID is changing Black students' roles. They're becoming caregivers, they're dependents, educators, and even full-time employees. Black immigrants are on the front lines of healthcare, food supply, education, and biomedical industries. They are our essential workers. Let's take a look at the healthcare sector, for example. In 2018, there were more than 560,000 Black immigrant workers in the healthcare sector. These workers made up 3.4% of all healthcare workers, a share almost 3 times their share of the US population. Black immigrant workers are especially active as health aides and nurses. These are the people caring for COVID patients or cleaning their rooms. Not only are they at constant risk for COVID, but are also witnesses of death and loss, often of those who look like them and share similar backgrounds. That can be a lot to bear when social interactions are limited, especially when so many Black immigrants are coming from collectivist and communal cultures. Black international students may not be able to travel home or travel back with COVID restrictions. Student visa status can be complicated, especially at one point when online courses were not counted the same as in-person courses. There may be an inability to see family abroad, so Black international students have either decide to stay in the US away from family or travel back to their home country, potentially jeopardizing their academic progress. COVID has also brought Black immigrants or children immigrants closer to ethnic community due to proximity. Jordan, a participant in the DBS study, said, if one person loses their job, they come over with some toilet paper and I give you some stuff. This is also important, as I spoke about before, because Black immigrants or children of immigrants are suffering from a tremendous loss and change, a loss of what was and what was once normal, especially the loss of life as their parents or other family members are on the front lines. Moving on to our audience interaction question, Regina, one participant in our DBS study said, how am I going to get an equitable education in the midst of this? Asking that of my community or asking that of my university and asking that of myself. So I'd like for y'all to answer in the chat, what did COVID reveal about the state of education for Black students, and what do we need to remedy that?
Thank you, everyone, for participating in our audience interaction. We truly appreciate it, and I appreciate the dialogue that's happening within the chat box. Feel free to continue having this conversation throughout our presentation. So now we're going to transition and focus on the college campuses. Most research on the experiences of Black immigrants focus on college access and emphasize the Black immigrant advantage, where foreign-born Black students are benefiting from Black policies while being favored because of their immigrant docile identity. These studies report that Black transnational populations are more likely to come from two-parent households and to have fathers that graduate from college and hold advanced degrees and attend private schools. Their families are essential for developing aspiration, and immigrant optimism allows a form of protection against structural barriers. However, these studies do not consider Black transnational populations tend to fare the same with other African Americans academically while in college. There is great diversity among Black immigrants, such as African American immigrants have higher college attendance rates than Caribbean immigrants, and the effects of immigrant status for college enrollment are found predominantly among the first generation. Black transnational population are more likely to be unemployed than other foreign-born groups. They are heavily impacted by racist national immigration policy agendas, and that Black immigrant 5-year college completion numbers are still low compared to their white and Asian immigrant peers. I listed some studies that are considered counter studies because these studies shows the Black immigrant trope, advantage trope, is not the full complete picture, and there's actually more nuance to it. Unfortunately, there's less study on the Black immigrant students' experiences in college, especially since the advantage may not be as much as an advantage as compared to research on college access, choice, and enrollment. So today's presentation will focus on 3 existing studies, one by Feraud-King, one by Stevens, and one written by Feraud-King and George Mwangi. We are looking through 3 subpopulations: the Black immigrant students who are students who move to the United States to be residents and then decide to go to college. We're going to be looking at the Black international student population, who we define as Black students who live abroad and they came to the United States for the sole purpose of attending college. And then finally, we'll also look at the Black children of immigrant Collegian experience, also known as second generation and 2.5 generation. And they are Black people who are born in the United States, but their parents are immigrants.
Thank you so much, Tita. I really appreciate that. And so starting with immigrant collegians, this quote is taken from my research study on Afro-Caribbean collegians and their ethnic and racialized identity while they're students at predominantly white institutions. While my data set focuses on Black or Afro-Caribbean collegians, these experiences are likely shared across the immigrant and international African diaspora. This quote from Keisha is an undergrad. At one point, my university sent out a survey about immigrants. There's wording like problems interacting with, immigrants make me uneasy, immigrants listen. I'm afraid our own culture will be lost. In case of political tension, immigrants would be loyal to their country of origin. So I was like, I'm a woman, I'm Black, I'm an immigrant, I'm Jamaican. So that, okay, wow, I actually am an immigrant and this actually bothers me. End quote. For Keisha, her university isolated her. This is indicative of what immigrant students are sharing, what they're navigating, and what they're enduring at their institutions. Students are conflicted. They're struggling with a lack of institutional support, explicit xenophobia, and anti-Blackness. Faculty, staff, administrators, and college leadership need to be mindful of this and other behaviors to avoid. This example highlights a university's complicit nature in upholding this climate, creating further problems, and doing a poor job of supporting these students. Suffice it to say, immigrant student needs are often overlapped with international student needs, and financial resources, including staffing and hiring lines, aren't always distributed thoughtfully. This is a problem. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So here we have, continuing onward, I have a quote from Anita, a master's student, also from Jamaica. And so I don't even have to study it to carry it. That intergenerational knowledge, it gets passed on. My physical, emotional, lived experience, not where my ancestors passed. I was born in Jamaica, lived there for a few years. I go back all the time. I'm very connected to my family there. I've lived in other Caribbean places. I'm very much in community with folks in the diaspora. That's my whole world. The unspoken and the spoken, the lived and the unlived, we carry within us, making up a part of who we are, our DNA. Anita shares how her racialized sense of self does not cease to exist simply because she is now an immigrant in America. In regards to Afro-Caribbean students' sense of racial and ethnic identity, they express wanting inclusion, thoughtfulness in regard to their Blackness, even if it does not mirror perfectly Blackness in an American context or an African context. Anita indicates the strength of her Caribbean identity, her Blackness, which flourishes despite migration, but flourishes with her various efforts to remain connected to home, to culture, and the Caribbean diaspora. This is in sync with Caribbeanness, which is taken from Martinican scholar Edward Gosant. Caribbeanness, in this way, expands Blackness, Caribbean racial and ethnic identity formation, and recognizes the geographically informed identity of our students that are showing up to our universities. Next, we have a slide from Amber, a PhD student who hails from Haiti. Moving forward to international collegians, we're going to be focusing on Amber. And this is also taken from my research as well. We had a job conversation. We're doing this SWOT, thinking about the threat, my advisor could come up with. The number one threat is her citizen status. Our political climate is just not good for you, he said. Whenever I engage here, my university, I don't think about Blackness first. You could get deported. All the things you work for can be taken away. I want to advocate. I want to challenge the status quo, but I have to protect myself. That protection becomes silence. If I think about it as like being Black, it's something you got to deal with. Being an international student, It's another thing you gotta deal with. And being a woman is another thing I have to deal with. Students are navigating how they show up on campus, the ways it shapes their academic and social experiences and on-campus engagement. As Amber shares, she talks with her advisor about the job search and her immigration status, making sense of race and Black racial identity formation certainly relates to William Cross's Nigrescence, a foundational student development theory. Furthermore, Amber talks about the convergence of being an international PhD student worried about deportation, a Black student in America during this sociopolitical climate, a student leader making sense of social justice advocacy on her campus while assessing threats. Her migration status should hardly be a consideration. Our Black international students are going to great lengths to mitigate danger and ensure success.
Thank you, Kat. And I will continue discussing the experiences of international students, in particular, the racialization process they undergo. Coming from majority Black countries, where the effect of race and racism were not part of their upbringing when they first arrived to the United States, Black international students quickly learned that they must discuss race. They found themselves in several situations where they were asked in person or through paperwork about their racial identity. Some Black international students attempt to distinguish themselves from African Americans because they see their international identity more salient because of their experience related to nativism, related to their accents, language barriers, the way they dress, and other cultural experiences. In addition, for some, avoiding close relationship with Black American is seen as a protective mechanism to avoid racial discrimination, similar to a scarlet letter. We have Rick here, for example, who's from Nigeria, who says he was very clear in his introduction that he was African and that he tried to lessen or belittle African American experiences because it didn't really affect him, or so he thought. However, even though many of the Black international students realized that even though they did not identify as African American, the college campus did not treat them differently from other Black population. They experienced racism while on US campuses, and these experiences included being stereotyped as ghetto, lazy, or violent by members of the college community. For some international students, since they plan to return to their home country after the school year or once they graduated, they try to ignore racism and minimize it as much as possible, seen as a protective mechanism. For other Black international students, these experiences encourage them to try to develop a stronger relationship with African Americans and engage in the community. For example, as you see Stewart, who claims that if anyone needs him, he's there as a Black man, and he's treated as African American. Their experiences become more of his experiences. Some have expressed their inability to fully ingrain themselves in Black Lives Matter movement because either they feel like they do not want to take space for Black Americans since they have a country that embraces them, similar to Stewart, who claims that he has to check himself sometime because he doesn't want to speak out of turn since he do have a country to go back to. Or they have been told by Black Americans that this was not their fight because they do not have generational history of oppression, and even though they experience racism in a day-to-day life.
Thank you, Tita. Let's focus next on what we've just discussed. As part of our audience interaction, we would like for you to answer this question and consider this question. Why is it important to acknowledge the differences between Black international students and Black immigrant students? Please take a minute to respond in the chat.
Thank you so much for participating in our audience interaction. Continue to share your responses throughout. So now we're going to transition and focus on Black children of immigrants and in their college experience. We're going to focus on two aspects of their experiences. We're going to focus on their development of their sense of perceived self and their sense of belonging. Black children of immigrants struggle with being from both feeling like they're in both worlds, feeling like they're not American enough because of their cultural upbringing, and yet also feeling not immigrant enough because they grew up in America. In this particular study, as the participants commented on how they found themselves and discerned who they were as individuals, they all referred to their ethnic identity as a proponent aspect in developing their sense of perceived self. For example, Malaysia, a second-generation immigrant from Liberia, stated that everything she did was motivated by her ethnic identity, which tailored her experience. She was a strong believer in ethnic representation in medicine because patients could connect with those healthcare workers that had similar background. She believed that pursuing medicine was bridging a much needed gap in the field. This expectation was overwhelming as there is a pressure in representing one's culture, but also an honor for her because she was helping others by being present. This sentiment highlights the importance of ethnic identity in forming the sense of perceived self because it dictated the decision-making process, affirms the individual person, and shaped their aspiration and purpose. Unlike previous studies where a non-nurturing environment, such as historically white institutions and predominantly white institutions, may waver out Black students' ability to accept their identities, Black children of immigrants students demonstrated that they have a strong sense of perceived self, and their ethnic identity is a huge part of who they are as individuals. And this aligns with existing other foreign-born Black student research and scholarships that focus on, that explains that foreign-born Black students emphasize their ethnicity as more salient identity compared to their race. However, when you talk about their sense of belonging, Black children and immigrants really talk about their race as playing a huge role in whether or not they felt connected to the university. For example, Uche emphasized the term minority by calling it a severe minority to illustrate the lack of Black students at his university and the lack of inclusion because of hate speech and other racist acts. He stated that these racist acts reminded him that he did not belong at the institution. Uche drew out how being the only Black person in his classes and a lot of spaces he occupied made him hyper aware that he did not behave stereotypically because he felt that he represented all Black people. Because of the lack of diversity, the participants also felt uncomfortable being on campus and the pressure to monitor their behaviors as Black students. These findings support existing literature that racism, the lack of diversity, and a lack of inclusion at their institution hinders Black students' sense of belonging to their larger predominantly white institution, regardless of their nativity. In this study, the informal relationship among participants with Black and Latinx students, regardless of their parents' generational status and nativity, supported their development in sense of perceived self and sense of belonging to their college community. Black children of immigrants greatly benefit from strong Black interracial relationships. This theme connects with all three groups of Black transnational population, that it does not matter how they feel about themselves as individuals and their unique experiences because of their immigrant identity. They are all treated as Black by the greater college community, and the importance of building interracial relationship among Black population, regardless of nativity, because of the symptoms of white supremacy. So we do have a poem for you that we hope will push you to think critically. You broke the ocean in, have to be there, only to meet nothing that wants you. Immigrant. And this by Nia Wahid. I would like you in the chat to answer who benefits from the narrative Black immigrant advantage? Who do you think benefits from that narrative?
So as we start kind of answering in the chat, Looks like there's a lot of agreement in the chat about who is benefiting. Thank you for participating. Feel free to continue participating. We've covered a lot. We've covered a lot. And I guess the question now is, what are we going to do? We have some recommendations. We've broken up our recommendations by practice, current landscape, and research. This particular section is for all of us who are engaging in practitioner work in various ways right now. There's great space in this moment for us to offer education or get educated on group differences and similarities within the African diaspora. Let our sense of unity also be based on our appreciation and honor for our differences in nativity, culture, and experience, in addition to our identification with the collective Black identity. Let's reflect upon the naming of various centers on campus. This is the time. Let's start doing it. Does the name make clear who the center is seeking to serve? Does the name reflect the evolution of the university? Great time to start asking these questions and finding those solutions. This is also an opportunity for identity-based student centers to involve professional staff in learning via professional development. Great time to start thinking about that. Finally, this is a good time to encourage more interaction and collaboration of Black students from diverse backgrounds through their shared experiences.
Thank you, Kelechi. So I will be covering the recommendations for based on current landscape. So we are all aware we're still in the middle of a pandemic. This is a time for us to be collecting data because we don't know the full scope of how the pandemic is going to impact people. However, we are aware of some of the impact of the pandemic and racial trauma. So we suggest that there needs to be more support related to COVID-19 and racial trauma care. Some support can look like additional mental health support that is culturally informed, childcare, additional funding, ability to work from home, the expansion on FMLA, considering schools are constantly closing down, better accessibility for students with disability while taking courses remotely. We feel very strongly that there needs to be better disaggregated data. And disaggregated data can be looked as based on generational status. So are you 1.5, 2.5, second generation, or your country of origin, the mode of entering the United States? Are you a refugee? Your religion background? We think it's very important for colleges and university institutions, anything that's related to higher education, to try to collect as much disaggregated data as possible to really understand what's going on. And finally, representation matters in this research and the work. It's important for us to have people who look like us and have similar backgrounds because they can share and discuss the nuances and give clear understanding of why people are responding a certain way.
After providing some recommendations, and as we conclude this presentation, we want you to take away 4 major takeaways. 1, ADOS, or American Descendants of Slavery, and Black Lives Matter are bringing to light how nuanced needs of various Black people are and how a diversity of strategies and tactics addressing these needs are being employed. Second, when considering Black students, we must acknowledge and be aware of intercommunal identities and or experiences. Third, Black transnational students are strongly connected to their ethnic origin, and some recognize the saliency of their racial identity due to racism and nativism. And lastly and fourth, Black immigrant students are being supported by staff, faculty, and institutional policies that acknowledge and engage their diverse intercultural, ethnic, racial identities in academic research.
Thank you so much, Taylor. And so moving forward, let's consider research. This is important work. It is culturally aware, this research that we're doing. It is led by faculty who are mindful of the rarity of a team this size and diverse. This 8-person team is led by 2 Black women faculty members, Dr. Ashley Carpenter and Dr. Crystal George Mwangi, with 6 graduate student researchers representative of the African diaspora. Furthermore, the contemporary research study is completing data collection for its first participants, Black students. This is inclusive of undergraduate students, graduate students, professional school students who are often not afforded this opportunity. At present, the diverse Black student study highlights the differences and similarities in the Black student lived experience and perception of race in their collegiate environment, particularly during this social political climate and global pandemic. An earlier iteration of this study was set to debut in 2019 with the Spring 2020 NCORE conference presentation. However, COVID-19 provided delays in our working timeline. With the guidance and leadership of our PIs, Dr. Carpenter and Dr. George Mwangi, the study has provided a rich learning experience for 6 future PhD holders and an opportunity to conduct contemporary research that we hope to see. With a well-rounded population of participant stakeholders, students, faculty, and staff, the research is currently ongoing, and we will be recruiting for faculty and staff in the future. Please note our email if you have any questions. And here are our PIs, if you want to take a look, they're amazing. And so lastly, the intentionality with this research is to engage in culturally informed research via the design, protocol, and recruitment processes. Here again are our PIs, Dr. Ashley Carpenter, who is an alumna of the UMass Amherst Higher Education Program and a first-year faculty member at Appalachian State, and Dr. Crystal George Mwangi, a tenured faculty member at UMass Amherst Higher Education Program. And next, we want to thank you for being with us here today. Here are our emails and social media handles should you desire to stay in touch or have further questions. Feel free to tweet with us about this webinar. And next, we will turn it over to Dr. Aringu for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so very much. Can we all applaud our emerging scholars? You'll be looking for these folks to hire them. And that is why we want to always support emerging scholars. So if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. We do have a few minutes for a few questions. So if you could stop sharing the screen, that would be helpful so that all of you can unmute. We want to see your faces. So questions, I can take questions and field them. I want to say something though as folks post their questions, that this was very eye-opening. And there were several comments in the chat as you all continue to present. And one thing I noted is that, you know, identities are complex, our lived experiences are complex, socialization is different, we all have very different experiences, but there's really a margin point there. And one person did mention intersectionality, and I think that is a framework that you all can also consider as you think about this. There was also a mention of, you know, religion, and I think this can also be elaborated that some of our Black Muslim students, they do feel marginalized. And that is an identity that is obvious because they wear the hijab, but we don't talk about that as much. But also that anti-Blackness really is cutting across the board, whether you are foreign born or whether you are an African American. It's very thought-provoking, and I want to thank you. So I want folks to drop questions if you have any questions. But I want to say something Dwayne Wright wrote here. This is what he said. Can we all examine neoliberalism in America and how America has developed a zero-sum context among minoritized people that leads us to fight against each other instead of the system that is oppressing us? So what are your comments on this? Because it seems like you're Black. No, you're not Black enough. You're foreign Black, or you're not a foreign. I mean, can you all address that? And what is your experience, or what has your research informed you about this?
That's exactly, I hope we accomplish in terms of sharing our research, is the fact that white supremacy, neoliberalism, capitalism, colonialism, neocolonialism that's still happening today, they're all interconnected and they're all impacting and purposely dividing us and making us fight for its crumbs. and making us think that it's the other person who has something and have the advantage. And that distracts us from the bigger picture. So we do hope to highlight there's a strong need and importance for a community amongst Black people population, and acknowledge there's diversity among Black population. It's okay to acknowledge that we're different and that we have different experiences and different cultures, but it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. And it doesn't mean that we cannot connect and support each other.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on the team that wants to comment on that? So Roberto Suarez has a comment which I would want you all to reflect on and maybe give us your response. I think it is important to note that the United States has appropriated the term American to refer to people from the 50 United States, whereas the American continent spans from Canada to South America.
I think that's an important thing to know. And one of the things we wanted to do in the presentation was really get into the use of language and the way the language we use, and oftentimes the language we have been given to describe ourselves, very much so shapes the way we view ourselves in society and the way we operate. So just that acknowledgement, right, of troubling language. What do words mean, especially words we use to describe ourselves, words that we use to build upon when we think about movement, liberation, theology, how we get free. All those things are super important to trouble and to ask questions about. So thank you for bringing up that point and troubling that word for us.
You know, if I can add really briefly to Kelechi's point, that, you know, there's just this whole conception of America, the big America, whatever that looks like when you hear that word. And so it's really important, again, to think about language, but also to continue to trouble it with like North America, Global South, South America. I myself was born in South America. The country I'm from has many, many, many different ethnicities within the region, within the country. And so there are a multitude of ways to acknowledge geography and to acknowledge the wreckage and the remnants of coloniality.
So there's also one other question here. Has anyone, this is from Moses, has anyone studied the impact of the taxes on the scholarships of international students and the barriers they create?
Do you mind if this person elaborate, if they could like answer in the chat, elaborate further?
Yeah, can Moses, if you're still there, I'm wondering whether they're saying that if you get a scholarship, it is income, quote unquote, and so probably you have to report it, and how does that impact the international student? But I also think I could wrap this in. International students don't have as many scholarship opportunities as legal citizens or American citizens. And maybe what impact does that create? And also if you get that scholarship, then it is income. And then of course that makes you pay a little bit back.
Thank you for that clarification, because when I read scholarship, I was thinking of academia, and I was thinking of scholarship in that context. But it goes back to talking about capitalism, and only a few get to profit over many people. And that's a part of capitalism. And who's likely to pursue a scholarship? Who's likely to need the scholarship? Who's likely to be impacted by getting taxed on scholarships? So then it creates even greater barriers on which type of international students able to come to the United States, and if they're able to even stay in the United States afterwards or during their academic period, especially with the cost of rising tuition. But to answer the question directly, I have not directly studied the impact of taxes on scholarships, but based on my knowledge and experiences related to the impact of capitalism and income, and especially on international students.
And honestly, in full disclosure, I just paraphrased that. I don't know whether that's what the person meant. I do have another comment here from John, and it's almost rhetorical, but it's also a really good question. do those in charge of these institutions want change? What steps are they making to make it happen? What are your experiences as Black students? Because I know, yes, you have international backgrounds, but your Black experiences in these colleges is really parallel to other Black students. So do you feel there's goodwill for change? That we want to make it better for our Black students. We want them to succeed. We want the experience to be great. What are your experiences and how do you see this happening? Is there a movement for change?
If I can hop in quickly.
Oh, go ahead, Kat. I'll follow you.
This is near to my heart. I would say that the change that I wish to see is what's propelled me to go down this particular path, to want to navigate a PhD and become a researcher. Coming from an admissions background and an administrative background, I've seen what happens on that side. And so I have an invested interest in creating more literature and seeing what we can find when we actually talk to people. And so having, this project DBS led by the scholars that are leading it is a wonderful opportunity to see their work, but also to propel it into a future space. Kelechi, I know you had something to say.
Yeah, I would venture to add that I think part of the brilliance of Black students is that oftentimes we find ourselves answering questions that other people don't even know exist, right? We're finding solutions to issues that folks are not even aware of. So I think when we have the conversation about whether or not institutions seek to solve this problem, I think the preliminary question is, do institutions even know that this is a problem, right? Are we even doing the work of disaggregating data? Are we studying migration and understanding who is coming to this nation, who is considered a Black student? I think when we talk about the goodwill of institutions and the desire, things become complicated. I think, individual institutions have different objectives and goals based on what they want to do and what may be incentivized. But yeah, I would challenge us to ask if our institutions, the ones that we work at, the ones we are engaging in scholarship in, are they aware that this is an issue? Are they aware that there are more people trying to divide the same size pie? And that perhaps the issue is not for students to figure out how to better divide the pie. Perhaps the issue is for students to be provided a bigger pie because there are more of us trying to partake in this stream of scholarship and education. So thank you. That's a challenging question, but fun to think about.
I like your response, but also I like what somebody else is saying here, Donovan Griffin saying, maybe it's a lose-lose situation as we talk about Africans and African Americans, because we are battling for the same pie. We are fighting for equity, but then now we find ourselves fighting each other. Do you all think this is a lose-lose situation? Like, Black Americans and African Americans and Black people in the diaspora talking about this?
I think it goes back to our original even start of our presentation when Kelechi did a beautiful job opening up and talking about erasure. These issues, they're not new. They always exist ever since immigration was occurring. So it's very important for us to have a conversation to actually address it. It's kind of similar to when people talk about like, don't talk about racism, or don't I don't see color, I'm colorblind. So, cause that means that racism gonna go away. It's like, no, that's not how it works. You need to talk about racism and you need to be anti-racist and you need to actively work against it. So same situation, there's always been an elephant in the room, as like one of the slides that we showed today. We need to address it. We need to talk about it if we want to actually move forward. And I guess to answer one of the chat questions about if you're an African-American student trying to bring this conversation on campus, start a conversation. And I would suggest, as a practitioner, I will start the conversation in a very informal, low-key aspect, where it's a group of Black students from different backgrounds, immigrant, international, native born, and we just start having a conversation on our experiences. We'll start seeing there's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. For example, some people like oxtail and others will be like, what is oxtail? And so having those conversations, and this is very important to start that and to break down the barriers and not make it seem like it's taboo or it's going to cause more conflict.
Yeah, and holding these institutions accountable so that they can actually produce and make those policy and practices changes. So Moses is actually clarifying and says he meant, you know, the income and the scholarships that the athletes have to pay taxes on. The taxes are different from country to country. So maybe if you're a foreign student on scholarship. And I want to say that our next webinar is actually going to focus on student athletes, Black male student athletes. So Moses, you can attend that. That's also a good question to ask some of those folks there. So somebody else asked, and this is anonymous, what about the intersectionality of African international students who identify as members of the 2S LGBTQ community and the discrimination faced within the Black community? So discrimination sometimes is from within. How do you address that?
I think in answering this question, which is an excellent question, it's an excellent question. I think a lot about an answer potentially to the last question. I think we as Black students and in Black communities really have to challenge scarcity. We have to challenge the idea of scarcity. In answering the last question, challenging the idea of scarcity and resources, right? Like if we were to have the conversation about trying to reach some form of equity, it would mean that some people got less and others got more. I think when we start to challenge these universities and their ideas of scarcity and say like, no, there is abundance, there is enough, we can make this work, then we find space. I think we have to do the same thing within Black communities. When we were having the conversation about the diversity of tactics based on the different needs that folks have within the community, I think there's a very good faith argument for the fact that liberation for each Black person may look very, very different based on the different identities that we hold. And I think when we come into Black community and we're able to say there is enough space for all of us, right? There is enough space for all of us to be all of what we are, to occupy all of our identities and to be free and to really decolonize our minds and have the idea that there is the space. I think that's something that we can do in Black community to make sure that we are making space for one another, right? So that we're fighting for a type of freedom, a liberation, and abundance that benefits all of us.
Mm-hmm. Decolonize our minds. I love that. Decolonize your mind, decolonize the curriculum, decolonize the spaces. Our last question, let me read it from Flo here. That will be our last question. Firstly, you did a great job. I agree. And she agrees. Secondly, I'm curious if you have suggestions for how to have a collective movement that appropriately accounts for and deals in nuance. To elaborate, within most liberation movements, there is an ongoing critique of how they mirror some of the oppressive systems that are hallmarks of the world around them, e.g. sexism and classism in Black liberation movements. Is there a way that we don't have to divide into camps like ADOS from Immigrant in a Black liberation movement and yet retain the nuance?
I think there are ways to do that, right? And I appreciate this question. I think it's a brilliant question. I think, and this is my positionality, so it doesn't have to reflect anyone else. But I think that there is a beauty to assessing and cultivating information from within different places and different groups, so that we can then see top down what's the same, what's different, what nuances, what needs are, and collectively bring that information, that data together and see what is the overall push. I think we run the risk of, without having information from different places or different people or pockets of information, we run the risk of flattening culture and identity. And we run the risk of essentializing our experiences, which is kind of dangerous. And so I'd argue that in order to pull together and work in unity, having an understanding of all of the things that we bring to the table is necessary. So I think to get to one point, you've got to be at the other point as well.
So, and I think that is what Diane Halley is saying. Even though we want to disaggregate the data, she thinks, and I agree, and I think you all agree, that there needs to be more education for those of them who are white and in high positions, or those who really don't understand what you are trying to talk about, because these conversations are very, very important. And unfortunately, we don't have more time on the screen to keep talking about it, but this tells you that your research is important, your research is relevant, your research is helpful, and I can't wait maybe to bring you back once your research is done, maybe on a face-to-face conference or maybe on another webinar, because this is of interest to me as well, but also is of interest to many people out there. So I really do want to thank Ed and Taylor and Kelechi and Tita for this amazing thought-provoking presentation. Please continue the conversations online on your Twitter, your Facebook, your Instagram, your emails. If you want the slides, I think our Anchor team have posted on there. You can write to Anchor Webinars. We are going to be in conversation with the panelists, and once they are able to clean up whatever they want to clean up, or maybe even add more, then we can share those with you. We also want to say that the recording is going to be available maybe 5 to 7 days from now, once our IT team has compressed that. But I really want to also thank every single person who joined us today. This has been our largest webinar for, I think at one time we had over 300 people here. So thank you everybody so very much. Please drop a thank you to our panelists from University of Massachusetts in Amherst. We thank you so very much. These are our emerging scholars. If you're a dean out there, if you're hiring, look out for these folks. They'll be looking for jobs next year or in 2 years, and you can tell that they are on top of it. They know their game, and they're hireable. So thank you so very much, everybody. So from the University of Oklahoma in Norman, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for my Anchor team. I want to thank Stephanie, Victoria, Kathy, Corey, Josephine. I want to thank our ASL and captioners from the Sorenson Company. Thank you all so very much. If you have questions to the panelists, you can write them directly, or you can write to us and we shall connect you to them. Thank you so very much, and everybody take care and be safe.